the FISAS report, and it's a report on the European dimension in sport. Mr. Rapporteur, you have the floor.
Thank you, President, and congratulations on your new post, Commissioner. I'd like to begin by thanking Commissioner Vassiliou, my colleagues in the Culture Committee and the shadow rapporteurs from the other political groups for the fruitful way in which we've worked together during recent months. The world of sport is in mourning because of the dead at a football match in Egypt. I'd like to condemn the violence, but I'd also like to remember the victims and their families. To draw up this report, I was in permanent contact with the world of sport. I listened to their concerns and I tried to reflect the issues that they want the European Union to comment on. The Lisbon Treaty has meant a revolution in the sporting world. For the first time there is a legal basis, Article 165, for an EU competence for sport. The first response to the treaty was the Commission communication called Developing the European Dimension in Sport, which follows the guidelines from the White Paper of 2007. We responded to that from the Parliament with an own initiative report with the same title. The report was approved by the Culture Committee with 22 votes in favour and 2 against. Now, I want to tell you about the things that I took account of when I was drawing up the report. Well, first of all, the principle of subsidiarity, which recognises the competences of member states, the idea of the specific nature of sport, which comes in Article 165 as well. But this is not a universal principle. It's something that needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. In addition, we have to respect the independence of the governing bodies for sport. Let me briefly now tell you some of the items in the report. First of all, volunteering. Thousands of citizens volunteer to ensure that sporting events take place, and we need to fully support them. Second point, doping. Substances used for doping damage sport and society. We need to educate people to prevent them being used. We need to deal with cheats, we need to deal with traffickers, and we need to deal with all of this in full respect of sportspersons. The report asks for the trafficking of doping substances to be dealt with in the same way as drugs trafficking, and there needs to be national legislation adopted on that. It's essential to support sport being practiced in schools, and it needs to be in school curricula. The life of sportspersons or their sporting careers end sooner or later always, and during their sporting career they need high quality academic education or training so that then they can become part of the labour market. Unfortunately, racism, xenophobia, homophobia and so on are present in sport, and because of this we need to implement new measures to get rid of these threats at sporting events. I'd also like to reiterate the undeniable benefit that sport has on people's health. It means a considerable reduction in expenditure on public health. I also want to point out the importance of sport as a medium for integration for vulnerable groups such as immigrants and socially excluded groups, and it's also important for people living with disabilities. We need to protect sporting betting from non-authorised activities, and we need to protect it from suspicions of match fixing. We need to recognise the property rights of organisers over the competitions that they organise. It also urges states to criminally punish sporting fraud. It's essential for the commercial exploitation of transmission rights take place in a centralised and territorial basis to ensure that these rights, that the benefits from these rights are distributed in a fair manner. We would like to establish a European Day for Sport and also a European Sporting Exchange programme. We also want to see Aboriginal sports protected because they're part of our cultural heritage. These are just a few of the issues that the report deals with. I hope I can have your support, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the rapporteur, for Commissioner Vassiliou.
First of all, let me also express my congratulations on your election. And also, as Commissioner responsible for sport, I cannot but express my deep regret for what has happened in Egypt today, which is exactly why we have to work for the healthy way of carrying out sport in any event. So I would like to thank first of all the rapporteur, Mr. FISAS, and the shadow rapporteurs for all the work in producing this excellent report on the European dimension in sport. I am glad to note that the European Parliament endorses the proposals contained in the Commission communication adopted last January. The Commission will carefully consider all the suggestions made in the report. 2 years after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, we are now implementing a coherent set of actions in the field of sport, and we are doing this on the basis of priorities agreed by the Council and the Parliament. Following the Commission's communication on sport and the Council's work plan, Parliament's new report completes a solid policy framework which will guide the EU as it develops the European dimension in sport over the coming years. Let me briefly mention some of the initiatives that the Commission is or will be carrying out in line with the suggestions made in the Parliament's report. They cover the following policy priorities: health and participation, anti-doping, statistics, sustainable financing, good governance, education and training. Several of the report's suggestions will be developed in the expert groups set up by the EU work plan in order to prepare concrete policy deliverables. In line with the Parliament's report, the Commission has been implementing a number of actions that we set out in our communications. These include recent studies on the funding of grassroots sport and on sport's contribution to economic growth and employment in the EU, forthcoming studies on health-enhancing physical activity, on the economic and legal aspects of the transfer of players, and on a possible sports monitoring function in the EU. And we organised 2 EU conferences on statistics and sports agents, which were very well received. Furthermore, thanks to the support of the Parliament, a third year of preparatory actions has been launched to address the fight against violence, racism and discrimination in sport, and to promote good governance in sport organisations. These initiatives would not be complete if we were not able to secure sustainable multiannual EU funding to support our policy. The Parliament is right in requesting that the Commission propose an ambitious budget for sport policy under the future multiannual financial framework. Thanks to your support, the European Commission has proposed a new programme, Erasmus for All, which includes a substantial chapter on sport. The new programme responds to our Europe 2020 goals, and sport, as an economic and social sector in its own right, has an important part to play. Thank you, Mr. President.
Děkuji vám za váš příspěvek, paní.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. And now, let me tell you that I will be very strict about timing, and I will be switching off your microphones if you do not stick to your time. We have 25 speakers and then catch the eye, and then 1-minute speeches, so please be disciplined. And now, Mr. BALZ for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. I would like to start by thanking the rapporteur for this excellent report. My opinion from the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, in drafting that, it was important for me to emphasize that in addition to the significance of sport in terms of society and of public health, it also is very important in terms of its economic weight. It generates a lot of value added, and that could be increased. But I think in general we need to continue to give precedence to the principle of subsidiarity when it comes to sport. I think sport needs to operate at a level which is very close to the people at national, regional and local level. And in addition to the points that have already been mentioned, I think the European Union should focus on creating an appropriate legislative framework, for example, dealing with public financing of sport, competition rules and advertising and user rights. And I'm happy that the rapporteur has addressed these points in the report, and I can give my full support to this report.
Thank you very much for keeping the time. I do not see Mrs. O'Coney. So, the next speaker, Mrs. Korhola. I do not see her either. So, the next speaker, Mr. Manders. 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, perhaps I could use the 3 minutes and take the 2 minutes of the two colleagues who are absent. I'd like to thank Mr. FISAS for his report. I think it's a particular shame that an amendment that was tabled in the Internal Market and in the Legal Affairs Committee and was adopted in those committees, which focused on dialogue between the Commission and professional sport organizations. I think it's a shame that that was not adopted in the Culture Committee. That means that we are failing to recognize that professional sports people have to respect economic legislation in Europe. And for example, for European competitions, that we still do not have sufficient equality. For example, minimum duration of sports contracts. There are huge differences in the way in which professional sports people are taxed. There are lots of things that are not working properly, and it's therefore necessary for the Commission to enter into a dialogue with the professional sports associations to ensure that professional sports are all on the same footing and that we can continue to enjoy these sports in the future, and that our young people will learn from that. So I would like to make that appeal, but apart from that I would like to support what our colleague Mr. FISAS has written in his report. But I think it is a shame that he didn't take on board the opinions from the Jury and IMCO committees.
Thank you. The next speaker, Mrs. BOZKURT.
Geachte voorzitter.
President, sport is the most important leisure activity for millions of Europeans, and it is a reflection of the society in which we live. It is the duty of the EU to try and establish a proper sports policy and tackle with the problems that exist. And unfortunately, it appears from the proposals made by the European Commission that these good intentions are not being translated into practice, into real action to tackle the problems that exist in the area. In 2010, 800 young people were abused in sporting professions, and we need to put an end to that kind of situation. And also the abuses of the registration system. We need to have a proper code of conduct, and we need to have a blacklist for the people who engage in these kind of activities. We have a lot of problems in sport, and I think the European Union needs to stand united on this and implement legislation which will put an end to discrimination in this area, and it needs to have targeted campaigns to make it clear that discrimination is unacceptable. That is extremely important in these times of right-wing extremism and populism. Criminals who are on or on the margins of the field work across the borders with each other, and we need to address that. And I think that these sports offences need to be included in the list of criminal offences of the member states. And sport associations have to realise that they need to cooperate with Europol and Interpol. A European sports policy is desperately necessary and can play an important role. The first proposals that we have seen are too vague. Fair play and brotherhood on the field is important, but we need to have a proper sports policy to back up those principles.
Thank you. Mrs. Seneshin, 1 minute.
Nevidím ji tady.
I don't see her. So the next one, SCURRIA, 2 minutes.
Thank you. And congratulations on your new role. I wanted to start by congratulating our rapporteur, Mr. FISAS, for the excellent work he has done. It really is a very complete report. And I think this gives an important signal in the field of sport. He's done a good job. He worked very well with all the shadow rapporteurs, and I'd like to thank them for the result achieved as well. And obviously, I would like to greet the Commissioner as well. Now, I think it's a very good sign that we're holding this debate, and also that we have achieved this report during the year in which the Olympic Games will take place. It is the highest point in global sport. It is when the entire world focuses on sport, and it's because of that that we have pointed out how important sport is in the fight against discrimination. It's very difficult, for example, for women to take part in sport in certain countries, such as Iran, for example. So we don't only think of Iran in terms of its nuclear choices. Another important point relates to the idea of having a European capital for sport. We've seen the European Capitals of Culture initiative, and that really is a time when relations between the elderly and young people are at its height. Now there's the issue of doping, and also we have traditional sports in the report as well. So I think we really have done a good job in terms of honouring our new competence in sport that we have under the Lisbon Treaty. Thank you.
Thank you. Now Mr. Ivan for 2 minutes.
Președinte, vreau să mulțumesc Santiago FISAS pentru că de la bun început a plecat.
Good evening. I would like to thank the rapporteur, Mr. Santiago FISAS, because he had a very consensual attitude. We discussed each and every paragraph, and we tried to find a common ground between the political groups so that the visions of all were represented here. And it is the merit of Mr. FISAS that he managed to achieve this consensus. Given the importance of sport in the European Union, hundreds of amendments were tabled. And again, I would like to congratulate the rapporteur, because his work is not simply an overview of the state of play in the European Union concerning sports. He did not simply try to make a presentation of the situation. On the contrary, the report contains very daring ideas, very daring initiatives, and it is very important that we manage to touch upon sensitive topics such as the status of underage children who are involved in sports, the situation of sports betting, etc. We all know that sports is more than just an activity. It has major implications on health, education, on reducing violence, on the economy as a whole, and on many other fields. It contributes to a stable and well-performing economy. So I believe that only 1% of the Erasmus for All budget dedicated to sports is not enough. I think we should give more money to sports. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the floor. Mr. AYLWARD, please.
And I too would like to thank the rapporteur for his excellent work and inclusive approach to this report. This report has drawn attention from across a wide spectrum of interests, from athletes, volunteers, sporting organisations and the media. Sport is intrinsic to the lives of European citizens. It crosses social divides and borders. It unites people and it enriches our lives. A European sports policy is not about harmonisation. It is not about taking the soul of competition out of sport, and it should not be narrowed down to a debate on the presence of the EU flag. The compromise text is flexible. It remains up to sporting organisations and member states to decide. The excellent recommendations in this report on supporting volunteers, strengthening and improving access to training, education for coaches and athletes, promoting traditional sports, eliminating doping and tackling corruption in sport should not be overshadowed. This is a report that provides us with a strong framework to create a European sports policy that is based on social sport in Europe to all the main players. As an MEP from a member state that boasts the world's largest amateur and volunteer-run sporting organisations, that is the Gaelic Athletic Association, with 1 million amateur members, I am pleased that this report has acknowledged the important role that volunteers play. There are 35 million amateurs involved in sporting organisations in Europe. The role of volunteers and amateurs is central to the continued success of sporting organisations in every community, and it is in this regard it is essential that the European Commission allocates a budget to sports policy. Sport is the vehicle that delivers on the EU broader aims across several policy areas such as community development, active ageing, healthy and active living. It has a successful economic dimension and is a social phenomenon that delivers on invaluable public good. Finally, I would like to highlight the importance of the right of journalists to access and report on sporting events. There is public appetite for sports news, and we must ensure that with sporting events of public interest, we safeguard the right of the public to obtain and receive independent news and information on sporting events.
Děkuji za váš příspěvek.
Thank you for that contribution. And now, Madame Ždanoka, please.
Thank you, Chair and Honourable Commissioner, honourable colleagues. I want as well congratulate Mr. FISAS as well as authors of the opinions with their excellent work. Our group welcomes the EU-level actions in the field of sport being mentioned in the Commission's communication. We support as well the proposals included in the Parliament's motion for resolution. In particular, we are satisfied that the report voices the concern regarding support for traditional sport and games as an important part of our diverse cultural heritage. We value them since some traditional games and sports are at risk of disappearance. The matters of big concern are some social aspects of the life of professional sportsmen and women, many of whom face an uncertain future at the end of their sporting career. This problem has been especially outlined by the leaders of the Latvian Trade Union of Sport and Tourism during our discussions on the subject. Europe should promote its social model, social standards concerning such a specific category of employers as professional athletes. I hope that the appeal to the Member States to consider ways of alleviating the financial burden on the lowest paid professional sportspersons will be perceived. Nevertheless, an implementation of a common European definition of the procedure and determination of terms of retiring for professional athletes and coaches is welcomed. Therefore, we do support the idea of the opinion of the Committee of Legal Affairs to call on the Commission to initiate a dialogue with all EU professional sport organisations on how to tackle problems arising from differences in the Member States regarding employment contracts. Thank you.
Děkuji za váš příspěvek.
Thank you very much. And now for 2 minutes, McCLARKIN.
There is no doubt sport has an important place in Europe. Not only does it generate billions of euros and many thousands of jobs, it provides health and joy to millions. I am passionate about sport myself. Under the Lisbon Treaty, the new supporting competence in sport should have provided the Parliament the opportunity to explore ways the EU could help grassroots sport through volunteering initiatives, community sports development, etc. But sadly, this report is a missed opportunity. Instead, it has turned into how the EU can take advantage of the popularity of professional sport, what sport can do for the EU, instead of what the EU can do for sport. The report focuses mainly on professional football. It takes little account of minority or grassroots sport, where I believe the focus should have been. The EU can have a role in influencing some aspects of sport, the fight against doping, cross-border gambling, but the report goes much too far in calling itself to sign up for WADA and doping conventions, rather than as individual member states. The report also ignores the limits of EU power, proposing special tax regimes, infringing on the right of member states to decide on its educational curricula, and touches on social security provisions. All of these are in the realm of member states, not the EU. But most damaging is the attempt of sport to wear the EU flag on their shirts, and to fly the EU flag at all sporting events. At first compulsory and now voluntary, the proposal of having the EU flag on national teams is still outrageous and unnecessary. Sport has a very special place in the United Kingdom, and our national sports teams form a key part of our identities and our heritage. The EU is trying to impose an artificial European identity on us by forcing our athletes to wear its emblem. Does it add value to sport? No, it does not. It is simply trying to add value to the EU itself. It is for these reasons, amongst others, that I am unable to vote for this report tomorrow.
Děkuji za příspěvek. Vidím.
Thank you. And I can see a blue card. Madam McClarkin, do you accept a question under the blue card procedure?
Okay, máte slovo.
Yes, sir, you have the floor with the blue card.
It's Jess, as a supporter and sponsor of Cambridge University's Ladies Rugby Club, for, I would now possibly guess, 15 to 20 years, whether they should wear logo on the front of their shirt or the back.
Chcete odpovědět?
Do you wish to respond, Madam McClarkin? 30 seconds.
No, I do not.
Děkuji, tímto.
Thank you. And now the next speaker is Madame VERGIAT. 1.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chairman. At European level, sport, like many other activities, has now become a slave, as it were, to competition, and also it's become the victim of purely economic interests at a certain level, to the detriment of its the role it can play in terms of serving society and bringing people together and helping them become more healthy. It is important, however, to import in sport appropriately so that you achieve a better balance between professional sport and sport for all. This means that we have to make access to sport equal or equally easy for everybody. And here our member state governments have a major role to play. They have to ensure, as I said, that there's access to sport for all, and also that the health interests of all people involved in sport are properly protected. Here I repeat that the member states have a major role to play, especially their governments. It's important that we encourage the member states to protect, as I repeat, the interests of all sports persons. For this, we need appropriate legislation. Sport should be recognised not only as a commercial activity but also as a marvellous opportunity for people to become more healthy.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. Nuttall.
Mr. President, paragraph 100 of this report clearly states that you would like the EU flag at sporting major events and on the jerseys of athletes. Are we now going to see the EU flag at the British Olympics, or at the Champions League final, or even on the shirt of the England captain? This is nothing more than sheer EU propaganda and vanity. The EU has never been so unpopular, yet here you are wanting to stamp your flag on sporting stars in a hope that you can force the people to love you, but they won't. What you propose also seems to break the rules of sporting competitions. For example, under Law 4, Decision 1 of the FIFA laws of the game, it states, the team of a player whose basic compulsory equipment has political slogans or statements will be sanctioned by the competition organiser or FIFA. But what right do you think the EU has to interfere in sport in such a way to encourage countries to break the rules? Because it's hypocritical, because the EU is in effect a political organisation. You even say in paragraph 20 of the report that political propaganda should be banned, which is hypocritical. Athletes proudly wear the flag of their own national countries. They should not wear the flag of the European Union. Thank you.
I can see a green card. Mr. Nuttall, are you going to answer the question? Please, you have the floor.
But I don't think you go far enough. Surely this is a disgrace. And surely it raises a quandary for sports fans. Because, for example, in the World Cup, if the national flag and the EU flag are being displayed, then who is the sports fan supporting? Their country or the EU? And would you agree with me that they can't support the EU because it isn't a country?
I would like to agree with my colleague. The EU isn't a country. The EU is a false state, and what you're trying to create is something very dangerous. Because false states, like the Soviet Union, only ever break up in one or two ways. They break up in peaceful divorce, like Czechoslovakia, which I hope that this organisation breaks up into, or in bloody revolution, like Yugoslavia, which I fear very much indeed. Thank you.
I apologize to the speaker. You already had a green card and we are under a time pressure, so we have to move on. Our next speaker is Madame WERTHMANN. 1 minute.
Ja, danke schön, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. The report about the European dimension of sport is particularly important for society. Article 165 of the TFEU creates a new competence for the EU in sport. Sport is extremely important for society in terms of public health, tolerance, tourism, etc. That's quite clear in my home region near Salzburg. In both summer and winter, sports activities are extremely important fixture on our calendar and the calendars of every family. And I think this report, it's important to underline the importance of sport for our elderly citizens and the importance of having more women in the decision-making bodies of sports organizations. The proposals that were made on corruption and doping in sport will hopefully be something that we won't need to address in the future. I'd like to thank the rapporteur for the report.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Madame MATERA for 2 minutes.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, I've always been convinced that sport plays an essential educational role. It brings out cultural and educational feelings, and it is important in terms of integration as well. The goal has to be to make sport more homogeneous and also to ensure that it is there for all European citizens to enjoy with no discrimination. It therefore can't be confined within the borders of a single state. It is of interest to the entire European Union as a subject. The European Union needs to act. Sport is going through a serious and persistent crisis at the moment, particularly as a result of criminal activities that have got involved in sport. You only have to think of the scandals linked to betting agencies and manipulations of sporting contests for motives of financial gain. Now, given all that, it is necessary and desirable to provide more control from the European institutions over the world of sport to try and do away with these criminal activities. Detailed regulation, which can be implemented, would improve the governance of sporting activities, and it is therefore essential to intervene to regulate the activities of sporting agents, the transfers of players. It's important to fight against fraud and doping, just as is stated in the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this contribution. And now the floor goes to Madam Childers. 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Chair. The debate this evening has pooled many valid and crucial reasons for the Commission to up its game and back sport more effectively in the EU. I come at this debate from a different angle as a former mental health professional for 25 years. The psychological benefits of regular sport are understated yet unquestionable. Exercise converts adrenaline into energy. It is a primary creator of endorphins. Exercise advances self-confidence and can afford someone a new lease of life. The many and varied benefits of sport are, I hope, fully understood by the Commission following today's debate, and I look forward to progress in this area. Thank you.
Děkuji vám za váš příspěvek a nyní pro...
Thank you. Mr. Takkula has 1.5 minutes.
Tällä erää parlamentissa. Haluan myöskin...
Thank you very much, President. I would also like to congratulate the rapporteur for this excellent report, and also I would like to thank the Commissioner for the excellent work she has done in the area of sport as well. Sport is, so to speak, perhaps a major movement in Europe and plays a very important role in European society, and it merits specific action at European level. This report points us in the right direction. Sport is good for people's health, it's good for society, it improves well-being, it helps integrate people in society, and we also know how important sport is for fighting racism and all sorts of negative social aspects. We also have to consider the financing of sport. And here I hope that we will produce appropriate finance in the European Union budget so that we can enhance the quality of the way sport is organised in Europe, so that we can avoid excessive monopolisation of sport in Europe, and perhaps also think in terms of legislation with respect to gambling in sport. I must say I was very surprised at some of the comments from our British colleagues. I was surprised to hear Mr. Nuttall, for example, talking about the special nature of UK, saying that I think I understood him to say that British players would not want to play wearing a European jersey. I was very sorry to hear that.
Thank you, President. May I too congratulate you on your election. Now, being British, I understand the important role that sports plays in our lives. What I don't understand is why the EU should be meddling in the business of sport. The EU should focus on growth, jobs and on the single market. This report has been through 7 committees and I've shadowed it on behalf of the ECR group in 2 of them. I had intended to talk today about the British women who are sporting heroes to millions, such as Rebecca Addington, Kelly Holmes and Paula Radcliffe. I wanted to talk to you today about how excited my home constituency of London is to welcome the world's Olympic and Paralympic athletes later this year. But I can't, because I've got to use this speech to denounce this report's calls to fly EU flags at major sporting events and for the flag to be displayed on athletes' clothing. I must also condemn proposals to waste money on the European capital of sports at this time of austerity. Brussels' bubble needs to remember we live in hard times.
Much for your speech. And blue card. Přijmete otázku?
Would you like to answer the blue card?
Our point about the European flag. It says here specifically that it should be entirely voluntary and up to member states. Now, what is her understanding of entirely voluntary? I'd like to know that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, if you'd like an answer. Entirely involuntary, it shouldn't even be mentioned at this stage. We're here to support sport. I don't mind supporting sport. We're here to support our national teams. I do not feel it is the right area to address this, and it shouldn't really be in it at all. The report would be stronger without this voluntary or not voluntary.
Děkuji vám za odpověď. Další v debatě.
Thank you very much. And now, Mrs. Joubert, 1 minute.
Obrigada, Sr. Presidente. Consideramos.
Thank you, Chairman. Sport is an essential part of society for the development of the individual and of society in general. It should be an activity which is not affected by discrimination. Sport should be supported by our member state governments, supported by schools, by associations, and so on and so forth. I think this report takes us in the right direction for sport in Europe by proposing a section of the budget to be dedicated to sport. Of course, this means that we should above all be promoting amateur sport, not professional sport, in this regard, sport for all. It's regrettable that we're now suffering from these austerity measures throughout Europe, which is going to undermine sporting activities in society in general and schools in particular, which is a great shame. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The floor goes now to Mr. Borys. 2 minutes, please.
Chciałem bardzo ogromnie podziękować Santiago Fisasowi.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking the rapporteur, who has been working very hard on this very important report for over a year now. This is a report that concerns our new sports policy, and this really is very important for thousands of associations and millions of sports persons. This is the report they've been waiting for, and that's why I would like to congratulate the rapporteur, because it's very important. Now, with regard to the future of sports policy during coming years, well, it'll all depend on us, but it'll also depend on you, Commissioner. There are some very important elements in the report, and we now need to see how they are actually implemented in reality. I think that the main elements are the social impact, the economic impact, and the impact on sporting associations, and I think these are all very important elements. Now I'd like to know how we can improve things, how we can correct our past errors with regard to sporting agents, for example. We need transparency in the system. I mean, this is a system that's supposed to find new young talent. It's supposed to help us train sports persons, so we need to ensure it does. A sports agent is a very important person. There's also the issue of the fair funding of sport, and that's particularly important with regard to training young sports persons. There's also the entire range of issues relating to match fixing. I mean, that's something that is really utterly unacceptable. There are sometimes mafia-style organisations behind that kind of activity. I mean, we have to ensure that sporting ethics are upheld. Commissioner, you and we face a major challenge linked to structural funds, and particularly the European Social Fund, to fund grassroots sport, and also to provide opportunities to sports persons who are coming to the end of their careers, so that they can use this funding to be trained for other jobs. I should say really that this is an excellent report. It's very timely because we have the Euro 2012 Championship and also the Olympic Games. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Smolková.
Chcem podporiť návrh uznesenia a stanovisko výboru.
Thank you, President. I would like to support this report and draft resolution. I think that sport should be a compulsory subject in schools, and I think that appropriate sports facilities should be made available in schools. Sport is something which can promote good health at all ages, and it can help those who suffer from social exclusion to become more integrated and fight against all kinds of discrimination. Sport is advantageous to all generations from the point of view of health, culture, and the economy. Sport is a healthy leisure pursuit for young people, and it can help them to prevent them from getting involved in drugs and violence. And as a former sportswoman, I would like to see more opportunities being provided for sportswomen and greater equal opportunities in the...
Thank you for this contribution. And Mr. Kelly, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, my condolences with regard to the tragedy in Egypt tonight. Now, with regard to this report, I want to say that I'm very pleased to have been able to have participated in the discussion, and particularly given that I had a lot of dealings in sport in the past, and particularly with, as I was president of the Gaelic Athletic Association. Now, we have a report which gives us an opportunity with regard to Article 165 of the Lisbon Treaty and putting that into effect, and I'd like to thank the rapporteur for having done that job.
And particularly that some amendments that I put down have been taken on board, particularly in relation to grassroots sport, which gives effect to the written declaration that the members so kindly passed here last year. Also, the possibility of growth in sports tourism, the European Regional Development Fund and the European Social Fund to be used to develop infrastructure in sport, and particularly indigenous sports, of which the GA, as my colleague Liam Aylward mentioned, is a shining example in my country. But as the Commissioner mentioned, and I was pleased to hear her mention the MFF and the budget, that's going to be crucial. And one argument we can certainly put forward regarding it is that the sport implies directly or indirectly 15 million people contributing 3.6% of GDP in the European Union. There are many more arguments, but that certainly justifies a good sports budget. There are other suggestions which I am very pleased about. I see nothing wrong, by the way, with the suggestion about the European flag. After all, where do you expect to fly the European flag? Outside the European Union or inside it? So that's an argument there. Also, the European Day of Sport and the European Capitals of Sport, which is a wonderful development. I've seen that in my own country as well recently, and also the Erasmus for All. A lot of good suggestions, a good budget, will make a lot of progress.
Thank you. And now Mr. Belet, 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Welcome, Commissioner. I'd like to thank our colleague for the excellent support and for the broad support he has received here. From the point of view of social cohesion, health, etc., it's self-evident all the advantages sport brings to us. And I think it is clear that we need to make room for measures which will protect the integrity of sport and which will put an end to the illegal practices that we see in this area. And in that relation, in that connection, Commissioner and President, I would have a couple of comments that I would make to some of the British Eurosceptics who I think have left the chamber since. Look at what has happened in Egypt, where dozens of supporters have been killed as a result of football violence, and what happened in Vienna today, where a number of football supporters have been sentenced to imprisonment as a result of violence in football stadia. That is why we need a European sports policy. And Mr. FISAS says in his report that there should be a stadium ban on fans who are guilty of violence, and that should apply to international matches as well. That's in this report. It's highly topical, and that's why we need a European sports policy. So we will give you 100% support, Commissioner. A database to exchange information about hooligans who are guilty of violence and racism. I think this is something that can be done much more efficiently at European level. As other colleagues have said, other areas such as the fight against doping and the fight against illegal betting will also be more effective at European level. So that's what we should concentrate on, colleagues, rather than spending the whole evening complaining about a European flag which may or may not be put on a football slip. That is a proposal that I fully support because, as Mr. Kelly said, this is something that is being proposed on a voluntary basis and subsidiarity is being fully respected.
Thank you very much. And now catch the eye. We have a lot of speakers. We will have to limit it according to the order of the speakers. So now Mr. MIKOLÁŠIK is the first one.
Pán predseda, vážená pani komisárka, kolegyne a kolegovia, šport je jednou z mála aktivít, ktorá stiera rozdiely medzi ľuďmi.
Thank you, President. You know, sport is one of those very few activities which is a great leveller. People can participate in sport without regard to their social status or their religion, and so on and so forth. Also, sport makes a contribution to improving people's health and has all sorts of beneficial social effects. Therefore, we should encourage people to take part in sport. We should encourage our sporting associations and encourage all our citizens to participate in sport. In a way, in that way, sport could play a socially cohesive role. It also develops a spirit of fair play and cooperation. Therefore, I will be supporting this report. It has a great number of very good ideas.
Thank you. And now, for 1 minute, Madam Ticău.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte.
In Romanian. Thank you, President. As Vice President of the Transport and Tourism Committee, I would like to say that sporting events contribute to the development of tourism in Europe. That is why we need to develop synergies between sports and tourism by modernizing collective infrastructures. An example of such synergies between sports, transportation and tourism is the tourist potential of cyclism. The Eurovelo project, which already has 14 European routes covering over 70,000 kilometers, is an example of positive contribution because it promotes social integration, strengthening communities, promotes health and urban development. May I emphasize the importance of the cycling tracks that crisscross Europe and especially go alongside the river Danube to the development of this region. I also want to emphasize the role of national and local authorities in the development of sports, especially by creating urban mobility plans and by allocating financial resources for the development of those infrastructures necessary for sporting activities. Thank you.
Váš příspěvek a nyní promluví pan.
Thank you, Mr. Paška. Thank you, Mr. Paška.
Chcel oceniť skutočnosť, že zmluva o fungovaní Európskej únie získala.
Thank you. The Commission, I think, can through other legislation provide support for sport. People in modern society lack physical exercise, which has a harmful effect on their health. So for that reason, we need to promote sport, and at the same time, it will lead to lower public health costs. By promoting an active lifestyle and more sport, that should be one of the big priorities of the EU in this area. Another priority should be setting a European framework for competitions in different types of sport. We should ensure that European citizens can organize themselves depending on the sport they are.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Dodds.
President, Commissioner. Northern Ireland is passionate about sport, and I speak particularly because in the last 18 months 3 proud Ulster men have brought home 3 world golfing majors to a very small part of the United Kingdom. And somehow or other, I don't quite think that the flag of the EU would have warmed the heart or brought a tear to the eye in quite the same way as that Ulster flag did on those very special occasions. However, Mr. President, I want to turn your attention to citation AH of this report tonight, which states that international competitions continue to constitute a reference model and action should be taken against naturalisations of convenience. In this context, I believe it is right to highlight the continuing problem faced by the Irish Football Association, the governing body of football in Northern Ireland, who in recent years years have seen several players declare allegiance to the Republic of Ireland despite being born in the United Kingdom and having represented Northern Ireland throughout junior levels. Thank you.
Děkuji. Dále promluví na 1 minutu paní.
1 minute, Mrs. Záborská.
Predseda, pani komisárka, nedá mi pri tejto príležitosti nespomenúť.
President, on this occasion, I'd like to point out that during the last legislature, Mr. Fiegel, the Commissioner for my country, undertook enormous efforts to support sport in the European Union. He gave a speech in the Parliament in which he said that sport develops characteristics and values which the European Union needs and really can be regarded therefore as one of the cornerstones of our democracy. Sport brings with it a number of advantages, but it also brings with it some disadvantages as well, such as racism, drugs, doping, trafficking and corruption. To prevent these things we need rules. Now, if I could say so, I am the honorary president of the ladies ice hockey team and I speak with some experience here.
Thank you. And the last speaker, unfortunately, is Mr. Matula. 1 minute.
In Romanian, I would like to congratulate the rapporteur for an excellent work that is quite timely in the debate in the context of the general debate concerning the fate of sports. Because sports has such wide implications, from health to tourism, from education to peace promotion. I would like to insist on the fact that we should pay special attention to both professional and volunteer sports. We know that investment in sports means less money spent on healthcare issues. I support the idea that senior citizens as well as children should be involved in sports. Providing schools with sports equipment is vital if we want to have a minimum of 3 hours of sports per week, which is the recommendation of the European Parliament, in fact. These are just a few arguments in favor of having a budgetary chapter for sports for the next multi-annual framework in order to also to follow the Lisbon Treaty. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you. I'm sorry, but I cannot allow any more catch-the-eye speeches because we still have to go through the 1-minute speeches, and we should this meeting should be over by 11 p.m. Madam Commissioner, the floor is now yours for summary.
Well, let me once again pay tribute to Mr. FISAS for the excellent report, and which is very much in line with the Commission's thinking and challenges facing sport in Europe. I am happy to say that the Commission is already implementing some of the main ideas expressed in the report. I will not deal with the question of the logos or the flag. As a matter of fact, I see that the members who raised this objection were in a hurry to leave the chamber. But honestly, we have many more important challenges in sport to deal with than this. And it comes to mind the question of violence, because as a result of the violence we lost 70 people tonight and 1,000 injured. So violence, match fixing, sports agent and many others are challenges with which we have to deal very urgently. As we look to the future, let us take encouragement from the Commission's proposal for a new programme, which gives us the tools and resources to develop the European dimension in sport. Therefore, I am looking forward to cooperate with all of you who are great believers in sport, to work together in order to achieve what we aspire for in sport. Thank you.
Já vám děkuji za tuto závěrečnou.
Thank you for your concluding remarks, Madam Commissioner. And now I pass the floor on to the rapporteur, Mr. FISAS.
Thank you very much, President, and I'd also like to thank all my colleagues who have spoken on the report. Now, I'm not going to waste any time in dealing with certain lies that have emerged during this discussion. I just say to them, go and read the report. But what I would like to say is that sport is extremely important in various areas that are extremely important for society. For example, integrating the most disadvantaged sectors of the society is important for employment and the economy and so on. Sport in Europe represents 15 million jobs, 5.4% of the active population, and it produces more than 4.7 billion euros a year, which is over 3% of EU GDP. So because of that, I am pleased to see the Commission's support, and I would also be brave enough to ask the Commissioner whether structural funds couldn't be applied specifically to sport. Above all, I'd like to thank the various political groups for their support, because it's thanks to them that I hope we'll be able to adopt this report tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the rapporteur. And just when I was a member of the Council of Europe, I would like to say that we were talking about violence during sports events, stadiums, and I believe that some reports adopted by the Council of Europe in this respect could also be followed, could also be studied. They could also enrich our contributions in this respect. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes our discussion on this report, and now the last point on our agenda, 1-minute speeches. The first one, Mr. Kukan, 1 minute.
Pekne, pán predsedajúci. EÚ je založená na zdieľaní a rešpektovaní.
Thank you, President. Let us never forget that the European Union is based on common values and rights and principles. This is part of the basic idea of Europe, and Europe cannot really exist without these things. And in this regard, we shouldn't forget that Hungary is a very important partner in Europe. Hungary is an essential part of the European Union, and on this occasion it is perhaps worth recalling the basic values of the EU. At the moment there's a great debate going on in Hungary as regards the independence of the National Bank and the judiciary. Issues and other issues which are anchored in the European treaties, such as human rights, democracy, universal suffrage, etc. These values are valuable and should be constantly upheld by the European Union. We all want Hungary to be a strong partner in the European Union, respecting these common values we all share, and I hope that Hungary will respect them.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Ivan. 1 minute.
Pan Ivan,
Mr. Ivan, your 1-minute speech, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to draw attention to the fact that these days we're talking about two very important treaties, ACTA and the Stability Treaty. These two treaties might influence the life of people in a radical fashion. We're talking about extremely harsh measures to be taken in the near future that will affect both the private life of European citizens and their jobs and standards of living. There are countries in the European Union where these treaties have not been discussed at all in public. There are heads of state who never discussed this issue in their national parliaments. Nobody knows, for instance, in Romania, what ACTA stands for, or what the Stability Treaty means. This is not democracy, and if we want to put an end to the crisis, if we want to have a united and strong Europe, we must protect democratic values. Thank you.
Další promluví pan Bilbao.
Thank you. Mr. Bilbao is next. Madam Bilbao is our next speaker. Sorry.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Between the 1960s and 1980s, thousands of babies were stolen in Spain. The motive was financial gain. Many mothers were given the false and tragic news that their son or daughter that they'd just given birth to had died. A death certificate was issued and there was a simulated burial, but the babies were in fact taken away and sold. In the Basque Country alone there may be as many as 600 cases that have led to 200 police investigations. So far